Jazuri, he's one of my heroes of the faith and a hope for a better future, and excellencies and so many friends. I would like to take a slightly different approach, if you don't mind, with all due respect. I've been to dozens of interfaith groups in the United States, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and elsewhere, and peace conferences. Heard probably hundreds of lectures in the last 30 years about tolerance and such, which I greatly respect. But there's a quote from N.T. Wright, who is a famous Christian author, who said, "Tolerance is a low-grade version of love." Tolerance is good, but if I tolerated my beautiful wife, I doubt we'd be married for 33 years. We have to go, and with all due humility, beyond tolerance into something that one could define more as transformative of our thinking. Because the same thinking pervades our cultures. I say plural, our cultures. We do indeed live in a deadly misunderstanding, especially between Islam and Christianity. The book that Ambassador Jazuri is so kind to promote for me is entitled just that, A Deadly Misunderstanding, and it is about my own personal journey. Many here have talked very eloquently about philosophy and views, so my tack will be just telling you a personal journey. I was a narrow-minded, bigoted member of the U.S. Congress, which probably doesn't surprise any of you. And I did not like Muslims, nor the Quran at all. And then finally, someone said something so obvious, it's almost painful. Have you ever read the Quran? And of course, in my ignorance, I said, well, no. Then how do you know that the Quran is such a bad book? So to prove them wrong, and the Quran is indeed a bad book, I purchased a copy and began reading it ferociously and was stunned by the vast similarities of the Bible. It wasn't small, they were great. And I recall that in calling my Assyrian from Iraq mentor, I asked him, could you please tell me a few key words in Arabic, like walid ibn Allah, the word walid, begotten. What does that mean in Aramaic? I began noticing, starting with that particular phraseology, that the Aramaic of the Gospels, Jesus spoke Aramaic, it was his heart language, is so similar to Arabic, especially of the Quran. That was a second shock. And my mentor, Assyrian, who spoke the Aramaic language, began sharing other similarities that I took his view and spent the last 18 years researching in more depth. For example, 90% of Christians in America, I cannot speak for Europe, in America do not think Allah is the God of the Bible. And you think, well, this is a small issue. It is not. A small group of 60 million Americans who think that way drove a policy that many on this platform expressed concern over, the war in Iraq. As did I, as a Republican, back in 2002, with meetings privately with Saddam's regime, begging our Vice President Dick Cheney to take a different view in 2001 and early 2002. Well, it fell on deaf ears because we live in a deadly misunderstanding of a mindset of war, a mindset of differences, a mindset that the other is not an equal citizen. After all, isn't this what this conference is about? How do we converge, or how can we bring Muslims and Christians close enough together that we can think similar enough that we consider each other equal citizens. Well, even in the failure to avert the war, in the midst of that, I did notice key words in the Quran and the Bible's Aramaic that were powerfully similar, including Allah. I went to a Christian pastors' conference, and this, I hope, will demonstrate what I'm trying to express to you of how we can become closer and actually ahi, brother and sister, akhti, if we just think differently. There was a large group about this size of evangelical American Christian pastors. I said, may I please read from the Holy Book? And of course they assumed I meant the Bible. They said, I'm delighted to do so. I said, please, faddal. So I began talking about Jesus, that he was born supernaturally by God speaking, be and it was. And they all shouted, amen. That Jesus was the Messiah, the Word, the Spirit of God. He healed the sick, the blind, and would raise the dead. He was taken up where he's nearer to God and coming back on Judgment Day. And I went on with probably another dozen or so phrases, but you get the idea. Some were so excited. They were dancing literally in the back of the room. Can you imagine? They were dancing because they were praising God for these words. But when I told them every word and phrase came from the Quran, their dancing stopped, their praising immediately ceased, and someone shouted out, liar. You see, this is the problem we face. I'm sorry to be so candid, but you know how Americans can be.
Fake news, huh?
Fake news, yeah. That's what I needed, yeah. So what I'm trying to share with you is simply the following. There is much more, as Ambassador Jaziri alluded to, similarities between the Quran and the Bible than any of us could fathom. And some of these findings continue to expand and grow. And in my humble opinion, after traveling and experimenting in 145 countries with some of these ideas, they are transformative of thinking. And I'll give you one real-life example. After the failure of averting the war in Iraq, and I'm very sorry for that, we turned our attentions to Darfur in the Sudan in the mid-2000s. I became a prayer partner with Omar al-Bashir of the Sudan, to the extraordinary disdain of the Bush friends of mine in the Bush administration. We began praying together and sharing these commonalities that heretofore have not been known. How can we bridge the divide on some of the so-called heretical issues between the two that really root Islamophobia, that are also incentive for radicalization? On both sides, we have problems of these so-called deep heretical issues, which in my humble opinion are simply deadly misunderstandings of the text. And when I began sharing this with President Omar al-Bashir, he immediately called a dozen of his top scholars. He said, this congressman is talking about the Quran and the Bible, he must be wrong, because we've not heard these ideas before. Well, to make a long story condensed, because I only have 1 minute left, we then had a banquet and a dinner, and the president leaned over and said, what shall we do about Darfur? As you recall, he was rather intransigent about deploying United Nations peacekeepers. And a week and a half ago in Sudan, at a Horn of Africa peace conference, Ali Kardi, the former foreign minister, a close prayer partner and friend, announced what really happened. And I want to pass that announcement on because it was simply a limited audience. It was literally these principles of breaking bread, of learning to love each other with rahman, compassion, tenderness, and studying these commonalities together that prompted his change of mind drafting a hybrid resolution that went through the New York General Assembly of the United Nations and ultimately deployed peacekeepers. In conclusion, Your Excellencies, this same principle has been applied in 5 other conflicts and other crises, even recently in Central African Republic that you mentioned, releasing friends hostages and drawing 10 factions to the peace table a year ago May. So I'm ending my talk and calling on this center to consider, with your able global support, a new conference to further explore and evaluate these new findings and how these new findings can be applied to real-life crises and situations as they already have, and be expanded much, much further. Thank you so much.